No other conflict before World War II had relied so much on spies. Every Axis and Allied power invested heavily in intelligence and sabotage operations, and at no other point in time were so many of these spies women. They were trained in stealth, deception, seduction, theft. But perhaps their most important ability was not to break under torture. This is the amazing story of the women who dared risk their lives and much more to help their countries win the war. Some of these biographies are so incredible that they went on to inspire novels and films, but not everything in their lives was heroism and glamour. What about those who were not successful? What did the enemy do to the female spies that were captured in the middle of a mission? Welcome to the Marshall Memoirs. Women at War, Female Spies in World War II. When one thinks of female spies, there is one name that inevitably comes to mind: Mata Hari. Mata Hari embodied all the intrigue of espionage in the 20th century and remains the most famous female spy in history. She was a Dutch dancer turned spy during World War I, who is said to have seduced diplomats and military officers into giving up their secrets. She was active for close to a year, mostly in France. On the 13th of February 1917, Mata Hari was arrested in her room at the Hotel Élysée Palace on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. She was tried on the 24th of July, accused of spying for Germany and of revealing details of the Allies' new weapon. A week later, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Mata Hari was executed by a firing squad consisting of 12 French soldiers just before dawn on the 15th of October 1917. She was 41 years old at the time. According to eyewitnesses, she refused to wear a blindfold and to be bound, and solemnly walked along to the place where she was to be shot. Her last action was to defiantly blow a kiss to the firing squad. After her death, her legacy lived on, not only in the cultural memory of the West, but in the army headquarters of the world's most advanced nations. For this reason, when World War II broke in 1939, most countries were keen on employing women as well as men for intelligence missions. The United Kingdom created the Women's Auxiliary Air Force on the 28th of June 1939 for women to work at military installations in the home front. The Special Operations Executive, or SOI, began recruiting female spies as soon as it was created in 1940. This organization directly employed or controlled more than 13,000 people all over Europe, of whom 3,200 were women. War specialists in the 1940s generally agreed that female spies would have distinct advantages over the men on the ground. Women could travel freely because they were not expected to work during the day. Gender stereotypes also helped keep the women above suspicion. After all, who could possibly imagine a woman could be a viable combatant in war? Women were more than viable, however. They were critical to SOE mission success. Though they would later be honored for their conspicuous courage, the female spies of the SOE were successful because they learned to be inconspicuous. They took on secret identities, went on secret missions, and were trusted with their nation's greatest secrets. 39 of the 470 SOE agents in France were women, with an additional 16 deployed to other areas. It was expected that women operatives used their femininity and played up to stereotypes of fragility or helplessness in order to get out of sticky situations or to gain access to different places. In fact, Winston Churchill and his men soon found out that, as several wartime accounts indicate, male agents were generally less resourceful and inventive than their female colleagues. Each agent, male or female, was given a code name or an alias and trained in specialist skills including wireless operation, how to maintain a cover story, and how to burgle and pick locks. Women usually learned fast and excelled at these abilities. The Gestapo gave Nancy Grace August Wake the nickname the White Mouse because of her uncanny ability to evade capture. When she learned one of the resistance groups no longer had a radio for communication, she rode almost 300 kilometers on a bicycle to make radio contact with the SOE headquarters and arrange for an equipment drop. Despite many close calls, Wake survived the war. First Aid Nursing Yeomanry member Odette Hallowes also cheated death. Embedded with the resistance in Cannes, Hallowes was captured and sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. She survived 2 years in prison, often in solitary confinement, before the camp was liberated by the Allied forces. These are just 2 cases among dozens where female spies showed incredible leadership and bravery. Next, we will explore the biographies of several women spies who, despite being captured, had the moral and physical strength to never reveal their secrets. Most of them worked for a special task force not entirely legal, known as the Special Operations Executive. The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, Special Operations Executive. Less than a year after the start of the war and faced with the threat of Nazi German invasion, in July 1940, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill launched the Special Operations Executive, or SOI. Soon it became unofficially known as the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, and its purpose, according to Churchill, was to set Europe ablaze. This was to be achieved by any means necessary. Officially, the ESOI had three main objectives: to conduct espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance in German-occupied Europe. After the occupation of France, it was added that the ESUI had to aid local resistance movements during World War II. ESUI personnel operated in all territories occupied or attacked by the Axis powers, making use of neutral territory on occasion. It also made plans and preparations in case neutral countries were attacked by the Axis. Both men and women served as agents in Axis-occupied countries. Headquartered at 64 Baker Street in London, the ESUI was led by the Minister of Economic Warfare, Hugh Dalton. Dalton borrowed irregular warfare tactics used by the Irish Republican Army 2 decades before. The Baker Street Irregulars, as they came to be known, were trained in sabotage, small arms, radio and telegraph communication, and unarmed combat. Agents were also required to be fluent in the language of the nation in which they would be inserted, so they could fit into the society seamlessly. If their presence aroused undue suspicion, their missions could well be over before they even began. Extensive training in resisting interrogation and how to evade capture underscored the gravity of their missions. Fear of the Gestapo was real and well-founded. Some agents hid suicide pills in their coat buttons in case they could not escape. They knew it was unlikely they would see their homes in the British Commonwealth again, but accepted the risk. Irregular missions required irregular tools. The ESUI Operations and Research Section developed unique devices for agents to use in sabotage and close-range combat. Their inventions, including an exploding pen and weapons hidden in everyday objects like umbrellas and pipes, would inspire Ian Fleming's James Bond novels. Operations and Research also developed a foldable bike called the Well Bike, but it was unreliable on rough terrain. Most of the group's inventions, like waterproof containers that protected agents' supplies during parachute jumps, were more practical. Portable communication devices were of utmost importance as radio and telegraph communication ensured the French resistance were not cut off from the outside world. Radio operators had to stay mobile, often carrying their radio equipment on their backs as they moved from safe house to safe house. Their survival depended on their ability to transmit messages rapidly and move quickly. Along with irregular tactics and unusual material, the British government knew an irregular war required irregular warriors. Women proved to be invaluable as couriers, spies, saboteurs, and radio operators in the field. Though female agents received the same training as the men, some men frowned at the idea of sending women behind enemy lines. The ESOI only began recruiting women in 1942, though the first female special agent of the war, Christina Skarbek, later known as Christine Granville, was in fact serving behind enemy lines before the end of 1939. In total, 75 female special agents were smuggled into France, Belgium, and other occupied countries by air and sea to support the local resistance through coordinating the delivery of money, arms and equipment, training and communications. Trained alongside their male colleagues in fitness, wireless transmitting, sabotage, and the use of small arms and explosives. Among other specialist skills, women were soon directly engaged in collecting and smuggling military intelligence, arms and other supplies, running escape lines, sabotaging enemy transport and communications, and, later, armed combat. Gendered expectations about war and of their skills and abilities meant that women could generally move around enemy-held territory more freely. Nevertheless, the consequences of discovery were equally deadly for the female agents, 16 of whom did not return. Collectively, the women's service was a significant contribution to the Allied war effort and ultimate victory. Andrée Borrel, Agent Rose. When the Germans arrived on Brest, a French coastal town in the far northwest province of Brittany, most locals shut themselves inside their homes. Andrée Borrel was inside her beauty salon, terrified like the rest. Suddenly, loud running footsteps shattered the silence. Andrée ran to the window. French soldiers were trying to escape from the fast-approaching Germans. In their military uniforms, they would certainly be taken prisoner by the Germans. Andrée quickly invited them to hide in her beauty salon. Then she ran from house to house, asking neighbors for men's clothing. Everyone was willing to help, and the soldiers were able to go on their way disguised as civilians. Brest had been the headquarters of the French Navy. When the Germans gained control of the town, they used France's ships and submarines for their own plans, so Brest's dockyards were always busy with German military activity. Frenchmen, whom the Germans forced to work in the dockyards, were able to observe activities and overhear conversations that were important to those trying to fight the Germans. One day, one of the French dockyard workers passed some important information to Andrée, which included a stolen document. Andrée passed it on to an agent she knew who was working in the French resistance. One thing led to another, and soon Andrée was working for an agent in London. From that moment on, her code name was Rose, and she was put in charge of one section of the Brittany Bureau of Information, locating and passing on vital information regarding German activities on the coast of Brittany. She reported on the movements of German troops and sailors, exactly where the Germans were building fortifications on the coast, and how much military equipment was being transported, and where. Allied planes began conducting bombing raids against the German Navy in Brittany. Andrée and her team were in charge of rescuing downed airmen. After hiding or destroying their parachutes, the team would find civilian clothes for the airmen, and then locate safe houses where they could hide while escape plans were made. A rescue submarine was sent to the coast one night per month when the moon was new. A resistance worker in Brest was captured by the Gestapo, and after being forced to watch members of his family tortured, gave the names of several resistance workers, including Andrée's. She had no choice but to flee to Paris and join the resistance there, disguised as a blonde. But then another agent was captured and, under torture, gave away Andrée's name and address in Paris. On May 10, 1944, Andrée was arrested. She was interrogated, brutally tortured, and put into a cell with other prisoners, where she stayed for several weeks. Just before her second interrogation, she received news that the Allies had landed on the beaches of Normandy several days before. This news gave Andrée so much courage that she managed to fool her interrogators into believing she was no one of importance. A few days later, Andrée and the others were packed onto a cattle car to Ravensbrück, the infamous women's concentration camp. They tried to keep their spirits up by loudly singing the Marseillaise, the French national anthem. There, during a roll call, a Nazi official stopped before Andrée and looked at her for a long moment. He then instructed a guard to take her number, so she could be sent to the gas chamber. A guard came up to Andrée and violently twisted her arm so that he could see the number tattooed on it. He wrote it on a piece of paper, then walked away and placed the paper on a table. Luckily, one of her Polish friends was able to snatch the paper with Andrée's number on it, return to her place in line, and then eat the paper. Amazingly, none of the guards saw her. She saved Andrée's life. For her work in the French resistance, which included saving the lives of over 100 Allied servicemen, Andrée received numerous awards. She died in March 2010 at the age of 104 in the village of Long Ashton, North Somerset, England. Hannie Schaft, the girl with the red hair. Hannie Schaft was born Janetje Johanna Schaft on September 16, 1920, in Haarlem, the capital city of the Dutch province of North Holland. She was a shy child, mainly because she was teased by schoolmates for her reddish-brown hair and freckles. While Hannie was a law student at the University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands was invaded by Nazi Germany. Life in the Netherlands didn't change right away under the Nazi occupation, but when anti-Semitic laws were enacted a few months later, gradually stripping away the rights of Dutch Jews, Hannie swore she had to do something. In the spring of 1943, the Nazis passed a law that forever altered the course of Hannie's life. All Dutch university students were required to sign a loyalty declaration to Nazi Germany, promising, among other things, to spend a certain amount of time working in Germany after graduation. Hannie, together with 80% of Dutch university students, refused to sign the declaration. She left the university and went back home to live with her parents in Haarlem. It was there that she became involved with a resistance organization called Raad van Verzet, literally meaning the Council of Resistance. The RVV had tied to the Dutch Communist Party. The RVV was a militant resistance group, one that used explosives and bullets to fight the German occupiers and Dutch NSB agents who were being paid to betray Dutch resistors and Jews. Women were always in demand as couriers for the RVVI, because they generally wouldn't be stopped and searched as much as their male counterparts. But Hannie wanted to do more than courier work. She wanted to fight with weapons. The RVV agreed to her request. Her first assignment was to connect with another resistance worker and assassinate a certain target. At the designated spot, the contact handed Hannie a pistol. Together, they waited for the target to pass by. A few minutes later, her contact gave her the signal. Hannie took aim and squeezed the trigger. But instead of hearing the bang of a bullet, there was only an empty click, another empty click, and then another. Suddenly, the person who should have been dead walked over to Hannie and introduced himself as the head of the Harlem RVV. Hannie had been given a test and she had passed. Hannie was always determined to take the most dangerous jobs available. She took the new name of Johanna Elderkamp, dyed her hair black, and began to wear fake glasses. In addition to participating in more assassination and sabotage work for the RVV, Hannie also busied herself with courier work, transporting weapons and illegal resistance newspapers from place to place. On the evening of March 21, 1945, Hannie was on her bicycle transporting a packet of underground papers, de Waarheid, which meant the truth. She was stopped by German soldiers at a checkpoint in Harlem. They found the newspapers and a pistol in her bag. She was immediately arrested. After they brought in pro-German Dutch witnesses who claimed to have seen Hannie in action, they noticed the auburn roots of her hair. They had finally captured the girl with the red hair, who had been reported to kill several Nazis in or near Harlem. Hannie was interrogated, tortured, and placed in solitary confinement, but she refused to give any information on her fellow resistors. A plan to rescue her failed. On April 17, 1945, 3 weeks before the liberation of the Netherlands, Hannie Schaft was taken to the sand dunes near Bloemendaal. A German SS officer took a shot but only scratched Hannie's temple. She laughed and told him that she was much better at shooting. Then a Dutch agent took out a submachine gun and fired, killing Hannie instantly. Her body was buried in a shallow grave. After the war, the bodies of more than 400 resistors were found in those dunes, all men and one woman, which was the brave Hannie Schaft. On November 27, 1945, Hannie's body was reburied in a state funeral presided over by Queen Wilhelmina, who called Hannie the symbol of the resistance. Hannie received several posthumous awards, including the Wilhelmina Resistance Cross and the Medal of Freedom from General Eisenhower. Noor Inayat Khan, Sufi philosophy and anti-Nazism. Noor Inayat Khan was the daughter of an Indian-born man and an American woman. She was born in Moscow on New Year's Day, 1914. Her great-great-great-grandfather was the royal Tipu Sultan, called the Tiger of Mysore, a Muslim ruler who had fought bravely for his lands and people. Noor grew up in France just a few miles from Paris, where she lived in a house called Fazl Manzil, or the House of Blessings. There she learned music, art, and poetry. She also learned a great deal about Sufism, the religious and meditative philosophy that her father and his friends followed. After graduating from the University of Sorbonne, Noor began to write and illustrate children's stories. She was planning to create an illustrated children's newspaper, which would be called The Beautiful Age, right when Hitler's tanks rolled into Poland on September 1, 1939, changing the whole world. Noor was strongly against Hitler's anti-Semitic ideals and was determined to hinder him in some way. She joined the British Women's Auxiliary Air Force. It was here that she was trained as a radio operator, communicating through a special type of radio by Morse code. After a while, Noor realized that she would not be content until she could be more directly involved in the battle against Hitler. What she didn't realize was that she had already been noticed by an organization that was waging a very different type of war. The SOE recruited her early in the war, and she soon became the first female radio operator to be sent to Nazi-occupied France. The Gestapo knew there was a radio operator in Paris, but for months, Noor successfully eluded them. They failed to track her down because Noor was careful to transmit from many different locations and because she was a very fast radio operator. She also possessed a keen intuition that alerted her to the dangers of being followed or the overtures of two friendly strangers. But the Gestapo was very resourceful. One day, when Noor opened her apartment door, a Frenchman named Pierre Carteau, who was working for the Gestapo, was there to meet her. A French woman had betrayed her location in exchange for 100,000 francs, or $2,000 of today. She fought him violently, clawing and biting at his wrists until he was bleeding heavily, but reinforcements were coming. and she was finally subdued. She then refused, throughout an entire month of questioning, to betray her fellow resistance workers. She spent 2 months at a maximum security prison until she was finally sent to Dachau, her final destination. On the 13th of September 1944, Noor Inayat Khan was executed, along with 3 other female SUI, agents named Yolande Beekman, Eliane Plumen, and Madeleine d'Armament. They were all killed by a shot to the back of their heads. A witness later claimed that he had watched Inayat Khan be beaten brutally by one of the guards, and it was very possible that her death was caused by the beating and not the gunshot itself. The bodies of the 4 women were then immediately burned in the crematorium. There have been reports that Inayat Khan may have been tortured sexually for the information the Germans wanted, but there is little evidence to confirm or deny these accusations, considering there is no body to examine. Inayat Khan's last word is recorded to have been liberté. This indicates clearly the strength of her character, as she died for what she believed in and refused to give in to torture. Her bravery must be noticed. She had performed the most dangerous job in all of France and then held out for almost a year under pressure without betraying her loyalties. For her self-sacrifice and bravery, she was posthumously honored with the George Cross. Nancy Wake, the White Mouse. Now, Nancy Wake's case is different in that she was never caught. She is on this list on account of how close the Nazis got, but she got away in the end. She had grown up in Australia but came to Paris in the 1930s to find work as a journalist. Nancy was tremendously curious about the horror stories that were coming out of Germany and Austria. Jews were streaming out of those countries with nearly unbelievable tales of brutality. She and her fellow journalists decided to see for themselves if those stories were true. They were. Horrified, she decided that she would do anything to make things more difficult for the Nazis. Soon after falling in love with and marrying the wealthy Frenchman Henri Fiocca, Nancy got the chance she had been looking for, several of them in fact. She befriended some Allied officers who were imprisoned nearby but who were free to walk about by day. Through these connections, she became a courier. She also learned of the escape lines that led out of Nazi-occupied France, across the Pyrenees Mountains on the border of France and neutral Spain, and finally, to England and freedom. Nancy became key in helping escaped Allied servicemen and Jewish refugees cross these lines. She would discreetly pick up the refugees or Allied servicemen from the train station, find a hiding place for them, and then accompany them via train to their next destination. Because Nancy was so successful in helping Allied prisoners and refugees escape, a description of her circulated among Gestapo officials. They didn't know exactly who she was, but they gave her the code name the White Mouse because she was able to elude their grasp so well, especially when they thought they had her cornered. The Gestapo offered a reward of 5 million francs for information leading to her capture. It worked. The Gestapo was closing in on her. Nancy's phone line was tapped, her mail was inspected, and she was being followed. She was coming under suspicion of being the White Mouse and knew it was time to leave Marseille. She packed her bags, bid a sad farewell to Henri, got on a train, and tried to follow an escape line into Spain, hoping to eventually reach England. But her trip across France and the Pyrenees Mountains was slightly more troubled than those of the people she assisted. On her 7th try, she finally crossed the border into neutral Spain, but not before being imprisoned twice, once in France and once in Spain. She had to jump from a moving train, got shot at by German soldiers, went several days without food, and spent some nights in a sheep pen. She almost froze to death while crossing the frigid Pyrenees Mountains. When she arrived safely in England, eager to start fighting Hitler again, Nancy joined the ESUI, but they had already heard about her successful resistance work in France. After she completed her SOE training, she was parachuted right back into France with her work partner, Major John Farmer, alias Hubert. She started to work as a radio operator for the resistance. She was soon regularly visiting and supplying 17 different bands of freedom fighters, which included 7,000 men in total. One time she received information that her situation had been compromised and she needed to retreat. As Nancy left the area in her car, one of the German planes spotted her and began to chase her down. The pilot was close enough that Nancy could see his helmet and goggles. She could hear the whizzing of the bullets he was firing at her coming closer and closer. She flung herself out of the car and landed safely by the side of the road. In the midst of the retreat, Nancy's radio operator got rid of his radio and radio codes to keep them from falling into the hands of the pursuing Germans. She knew they would soon run out of supplies and weapons. It was essential to obtain a radio and new codes, And Nancy knew that there was only one way to do it. She got on a bike and pedaled to the nearest radio operator to ask London to send a new radio and new codes. The nearest radio operator was 200 kilometers or 125 miles away. On her way, whenever German soldiers passed her on the road, Nancy smiled and waved. They never knew she was the dangerous white mouse. Irena Sendler, a heart of gold. Irena Sendler was a Polish Christian who had many ties to the Jewish community. Her father had been a doctor who often cared for patients who couldn't pay him back, including many Jews. One of her good friends was a Jewish woman named Ewa. They were both social workers for the Department of Social Welfare in Warsaw, providing whatever was necessary to the poorest people in the city, especially any children living in poverty. When the Jewish ghetto was formed in Warsaw, Ewa and Irena suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a 9-foot brick wall, a wall guarded diligently by the Germans day and night. It wasn't easy for Poles to get in, and it was nearly impossible for Jews to get out. Irena and Ewa began working together to provide help for the neediest Jews in the ghetto, the children. Children were the most vulnerable to the two biggest threats associated with ghetto life, disease and hunger. The most effective way to save them was to get them out. The first children Irena secretly removed were those who had been orphaned and left homeless on the ghetto streets. But even the children who still had parents were at great risk for disease and undernourishment, and there was always the growing threat of deportation to camps, a dark and unknown destiny. Children, Irena knew, would be the easiest to save. The Nazi and Soviet occupation had created many orphans. The Jewish children could pretend to be Polish orphans. Rescued children were each given a new Polish name to replace their Jewish one, to protect them from the Nazis. Irena made up a list on small strips of tissue paper that contained each child's false Polish name, true Jewish name, and location where he or she was currently living. She placed 2 identical lists into 2 separate bottles and buried them under an apple tree in a friend's yard. She had to be extremely careful in hiding the lists. If the Nazis found them, they would be able to track down every single child Irena had saved. On October 20th, 1943, Irena was having a party to celebrate her name day, a very important date for Polish Christians. She set aside the identification lists that she had been updating. One of her friends, an associate in the work to hide Jewish children, stayed overnight. Suddenly, in the early morning hours, there was a horrendous pounding at the door. It was the Gestapo. Irena ran straight to the lists and threw them to her friend, who caught them and promptly placed them inside her bra. The Gestapo spent 2 hours in Irena's apartment, trashing the place and abusing them verbally. When they couldn't find anything related to resistance work, the Nazis ordered Irena to come with them. She dressed in a hurry, forgetting to put on her shoes. The sooner they all left the apartment, the less likely the Gestapo would be to find the lists of children's names. The Gestapo interrogated Irena in 2 locations. The second time at the infamous Pauiak prison, a place of unspeakable horror. They were doing whatever they could to get her to talk. They showed her a list of informers who had betrayed her, and they advised her to do the same. They tortured her repeatedly, beating her feet and legs until they broke her bones. She refused to say anything, so the Nazis finally decided to execute her. Just before she was to be executed, Irena was suddenly released instead. Apparently, resistance workers had bribed a Nazi official to free her. Irena actually saw posters that publicly announced her death. When the war was over and it was time to reunite the children with their parents, it was discovered that most of the parents had died in the Treblinka death camp. Many of these orphans were relocated to Israel, where they were able to grow up with a strong Jewish identity. In total, Irena had directly saved or helped to save 2,500 of them. Andrée Borrel, codenames Denise and Monique. Andrée Raymond Borrel was born in 1919 in a suburb of Paris. Her father Louis died when she was 11, and to help support her family, Borrel left school at 14 to work for a dress designer. When she was 16, her family moved to Paris, where Borrel spent 2 years as a shop assistant in a bakery. In October 1939, Andrée's mother was advised to move to a warmer climate for her health, so she took Andrée and her sister to Toulon on the Mediterranean coast, where they had family friends. As she was a socialist, he traveled to Spain in 1939 to help the Republican government in its fight against the Nazi-backed fascists in Spain. However, she found that the war was almost lost and returned to France. When World War II broke, she started working for the Red Cross. While working at a hospital as a nurse, She became acquainted with a doctor named Dufour, who was involved in an underground resistance organization called the Pat Line. Andrée started to collaborate with the Pat Line as soon as she learned of its existence. In December 1941, the escape network operated by the Pat Line had been compromised by the Germans. Andrée and Dufour fled to avoid arrest, escaping over the Pyrenees in mid-February 1942 to Spain, and from there to Portugal, where they flew to England. Like other women on this list, Andrée was approached by the SUI and joined it on the 15th of May 1942. After her training, she was promoted to lieutenant and given a new identity, Denise Urbain. In September 1942, Denise was the first female agent of SOE to arrive in France by parachute, which also made her the first female secret agent known to have parachuted into enemy territory. This operation was known as White Beam, and its objective was to set up resistance networks in Paris and northern France. They successfully mounted and ran an escape network, which they called Prosper. This network grew rapidly, bringing attention of the Gestapo. The rapid growth of Prosper and the large number of people associated with the network, including nearly 30 SUI agents sent from Britain, resulted in loose security. German suppression of Prosper began in April 1943. On 23 and the 24th of June 1943, the secret police, the intelligence agency of the SS based at 84 Avenue Foch in Paris and headed by Major Joseph Kiefer, struck at Prosper's leadership. Denise and others were arrested. Hundreds of others, including both French helpers and SOE agents, were also arrested in the following months. Denise was heavily interrogated, but according to one witness, exhibited a fearless contempt for her captors, maintaining a silence that could not be broken. Later, she was transferred to the Fresnes prison, where she was able to smuggle out notes to her mother written on cigarette paper hidden in some lingerie she sent her sister for washing. Most messages were to reassure her mother and request items like a notebook and hairpins ending with many kisses. Borrel's mother and sister lived in Paris. On the 13th of May 1944, Denise, along with 3 other captured female SUI agents, Vera Lee, Sonia Olshanesky and Diana Rowden, were moved from Fresnes to 84 Avenue Foch. Later that day, they were taken to the railway station and each handcuffed to a guard upon boarding the train. They were taken to Germany and placed in solitary confinement in the Karlsruhe prison. 2 months later, they were escorted by 2 Gestapo men 100 kilometers southwest by closed truck to the Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp in France. Once there, one of the escorts revealed the reason for their transfer. They were to be executed immediately. SS camp personnel took them to the crematorium. Inside the building housing the crematorium, each woman in turn was told to undress for a medical check, and a doctor gave her an injection for what he told one of them was a vaccination against typhus, but was in fact a 10 cubic centimeters dose of phenol, which the doctor believed was lethal. When the women became unconscious after the injection, they were inserted into the crematorium oven. That was the last time Denise was ever seen alive. Diet Eman, Triumph of the Faith. When the Nazi army invaded the Netherlands on May 10, 1940, Diet Eman was only 20 years old. After 5 days of defensive fighting, and after the city of Rotterdam was bombed to the ground, the Netherlands surrendered to Germany. Diet and her fiancé, Hein Sietsma, formed a resistance group with some friends. At first, they just listened to the forbidden BBC broadcasts together and spread what they heard to as many people as they could. But when the Nazis began to enact laws against Dutch Jews, Diet's resistance work began in earnest. Soon, Hein and Diet were both busy with resistance work, usually apart from each other. Diet would deliver false identification papers and extra ration cards to whoever needed them, whether they were on a farm or in the city. Diet and Hein did not have much opportunity to be together since they were both very involved in resistance work, but on one rare occasion they finally got to spend an entire day together, biking and sharing a picnic. A few days later, on April 26, 1944, Hein was arrested. He had been caught carrying stolen ration cards and other items that clearly identified him as a member of the resistance. He was able to smuggle out a note to warn everyone of his arrest, telling Diet to change her name again because the Gestapo had found papers on Hein that pointed them to a person named Willy van Dalen. Now Diet became Willy Larman, an uneducated maid. A few weeks later, Diet woke up certain that she would be arrested. But she couldn't just stay home. She had work to do. She needed to deliver ration cards and blank ID cards, some of them for recently downed Allied airmen who needed to get back to England. She hid the envelope in her blouse. Diet was traveling by train that day. While aboard the train, a German officer asked Diet for her ID. It was a new ID showing Diet's identity as Willy Lahmann. The officer could tell that it was false. Diet was asked to get off the train and waited on a bench with 6 officers sitting in a half circle around her. She knew that she would be searched, and upon the discovery of the packet of illegal documents in her blouse, she would be arrested, probably be shot, and then many others would likely be arrested. She needed to get rid of the envelope when the officers weren't looking, but that was clearly impossible. She was surrounded. However, she took advantage of the only time nobody was looking to throw the papers as far as she could. She wasn't seen. Because she had been caught with a fake ID, Diet was taken to the prison in Scheveningen and then to the Voet concentration camp, where she was to be questioned. Knowing all along that she might be caught someday, Diet had always planned to remain silent. But while imprisoned in Scheveningen, she met an Allied spy, Beatrix Terwint, who had been interrogated before and advised Diet to create a completely new story with a new identity and to carefully memorize the facts of this false story. Diet did this carefully for 4 months. After the 4 months passed, came her hearing. As Diet went through the hearing, pretending to be uneducated Willy Lahmann, she gradually realized that the healthy German officers seated comfortably in that room, who were there to decide her fate, were the real prisoners, not she. She became convinced that God was on her side. Her hatred for these Germans melted into pity, and she was filled with an overwhelming peace. She answered all of the questions asked of her with her carefully memorized details. Whether or not the Germans truly believed Diet's story, they eventually decided to release her. She returned to her farm, where she continued her resistance work until the end of the war, more determined than ever to fight the Nazis. Diet was overjoyed when Canadian troops eventually rolled past the farm, signaling the end of the Nazi regime, and she eagerly awaited news of Heinz's return. But he didn't come back. She received news that he had died at the Dachau concentration camp after surviving 2 previous camps. Out of the cases we have seen, most of them ended in death for the spies. This should serve as a reminder of the stakes that these women assumed when going undercover into enemy territory. Some of them came back on the field, even when they had managed to escape once. These women gave their lives for the greater good of a peaceful Europe and a world free of fascism. May their heroic and incredible stories be a reminder that our world today is what it is thanks to them, and to the hundreds of anonymous heroines whose names and stories did not survive the test of time.